In this video, I'm going to show you how to place the rear brakes on this Dodge Durango. Pads and rotors located right behind your rear wheel, so let's get started. Use a 22mm socket to remove all 5 lug nuts and then remove the wheel. Let's remove this spring retainer here. Have a hand over it and try to pry it off. It's hooked in right in here on the caliper and it holds the outside of the caliper on the bracket. It helps if you can pry in on it while pulling out at the same time. Of course, be careful of any pinch points. It also helps to have 2 prying devices at the same time so that you can push in on this hook while you pry out, just like that, and then remove it from the bottom. Next, we need to compress the piston of the caliper. I find it a lot easier to do it now. So I'm going to pop off the cap off the bleeder screw, and I have a collection receptacle that has a hose on it, which will help me not spill fluid anywhere. Now I'm going to put this over, and with a 10mm wrench, crack free the bleeder screw. And I'm going to use a pry bar and just very gently push the piston back in right here through the rotor. No fluid was spilt, pistons recessed all the way into the caliper bore, and I'm going to close this off. If you think you had any air get into the caliper, you can leave the bleeder screw open for another 5-10 seconds. That should bleed it out. Now remove your hose if you used one. It's very helpful to have it because there's no spillage of any brake fluid happening. If you had any brake fluid spill, clean it off with brake parts cleaner. Cap this off, and let's remove the caliper. To remove this caliper, you'll have 2 plastic caps covering up the slide pins, one there and one right over here. Remove both. Now you'll need a 7mm hex socket or an H7 to break these free. I'm going to leave this one in a few threads while I break free the lower one, which is kind of tight in here. You'll need a low profile wrench, or you could use a hex wrench as opposed to a hex socket, which should fit a whole lot better in here. I don't want to get my tool stuck, so I'm going to remove it before it's too late. However, a little trick is, once you put this back on, you can use a wrench on the hex part. For me, it's an 8mm wrench. For you, it might be something different based on what type of tool you have, but you can use this to finish unthreading the slide pin out of the caliper. And just keep in mind that because this is floating in here, once it's off the threads, it's just going to keep spinning. It's not actually going to come out unless you push it out. And that's it right there. Take the socket out. You can push the slide pin right through. Finish removing the top one. You might need to push the slide pins more out of the way if they keep getting stuck. Okay, there we go. Flip this over, remove the slide pins completely because we will need to clean these up and re-lubricate inside of their bores. And we'll have to remove this inner pad which gets clipped onto the piston. Slide it out, inspect the caliper to make sure it's in good condition, it's not leaking or has a torn boot. This one looks good, so I'll set it aside. Don't hang it by the brake hose, that's going to damage it, so tuck it up on the control arm. Remove the outer pad. Now use an 18mm socket to remove the 2 bolts that hold the caliper bracket on the knuckle. Take this off and set it aside for cleaning. In the center, before removing the rotor, you'll have to remove this O-ring. It's easiest if you use a pick, just make sure you don't damage it. Now remove the rotor. Make sure your parking brake isn't set because that's going to make it stuck on here. And if it's seized on the hub, tap between the lug studs. Be careful not to hit them, but that should break it free. The hub surface needs to be cleaned, and this one is in very good condition actually. There is really not much to clean. So I'm just going to take a wire brush, remove any dirt, debris, and potential surface rust that might be here. Then of course we'll coat it with an anti-corrosive coating so it doesn't continue rusting in the future. Once you're done cleaning it, use brake parts cleaner to rinse it down. And use a thin layer of anti-seize on this inner ring and on the outer ring to coat it so that it doesn't corrode in the future. Don't put too much, because if you do, it'll fling onto the rotor as you drive, and that's not something you want. Otherwise, it'll coat the inside of the rotor where the parking brake shoes go. Not only will it contaminate them, but prevent the parking brake shoes from actually grabbing, which is not a good thing. And the inner ridge here in the middle, you don't necessarily have to coat it, so I'm just putting a very, very thin layer so it doesn't corrode, but the rotor doesn't touch it, so the risk of it seizing is very minimal. Take the new rotor and put it on backwards just so you can clean it. A lot of times rotors are covered with oil. This one is coated with a special coating that does not contain oil, but I will still clean it. I like to do that so that it's free of any fingerprints or any grease. Take brake parts cleaner and clean not only the main braking surface, but also the surface where the parking brake shoes ride. You don't want any oils coating this. Once you've done that, flip it over, install it the right way. At this point, you can also check the adjustment of your parking brake shoes, which we didn't touch, and it was perfectly adjusted, so it should still be. Clean the outside. Let's put that O-ring back. The easiest way to do it is to start it at the top and just roll it over at the bottom. Make sure it's fully seated. That's also going to hold the rotor on, so that's perfect. I have my bracket on the bench, and there really isn't much to clean because there's no anti-rattle clips or slide pins in the bracket. The pads sit right here on these grooves, and all we need to do is clean them up. Mine are not corroded or rusted, they're just dirty, so a wire brush should do the trick. Now if yours is corroded, don't sand down too much because this is the actual bracket and you'll need a new bracket if you remove too much material. So start with a wire brush and remove as little material as possible. Once you're done, rinse it off with brake parts cleaner. And I wouldn't typically coat this with anything, but because the pads go directly on this, I will put a very thin layer of brake-rated silicone paste. You could use brake grease if you want. Very, very thin layer, and you don't have to, but I like to do this because this vehicle lives in a very rust-prone climate, and I don't want the pads to get stuck on here. Take the caliper bracket and line it up with the knuckle. Have your 2 bolts ready and start them on. These are going in nice and smooth. Make sure they're not cross-threading. I like to start everything by hand. Now that they're bottomed out, let's torque them. The torque on both of these bolts is 89 foot-pounds. All right, let's put the new pads on. The outer one just slides over the bracket. The inner pad gets clipped inside of the piston. And to do this, you can either press it in by hand. Sometimes that works, but a lot of times that's difficult. So here's a trick that I usually do, and that is to take your pad, line it up, put your caliper depressor tool in here, which is what you would be using to push the piston back in if you didn't already do it. And use this to very gently push the pad in. Perfect. I also want to add some grease inside the slider pin boots here. Not a lot, because the slider pin is a very tight fit in here, so any excess grease will just be pushed out the other side, and I don't want it all over the rotor. So I'm just going to put a little bit, lubricate this area, and then take your caliper, slide it right over with the pad. With the slider pins cleaned up and ready to go in, line them up, push them through. Start them in. I'm going to start with the top one because it's easier. And the bottom one. Snug these up. The torque on these 2 slide pins is 21 foot-pounds. There we go. If you can't fit your torque wrench, just do your best to get them nice and snug. Put these caps back on. This will protect the slider pins from debris and make sure that no grease leaks out. Now let's reinstall this spring clip. Hook it on to the top first, just like this. although if you wanted to start on the bottom, that wouldn't really make much of a difference. Press it on like that. This actually can't stay here, it has to come up and around. Okay, and there we go. So it's hooked on, but you want to make sure it's fully seated by pressing these in. You shouldn't be able to see the end of the hook on the outer ridge of this hole. It's cut out wider inside, so it'll recess and hook in, and you should not be able to just pry this out easily. It should be locked in. Brakes are back together on this side, so let's get the wheel back on. Let's get the wheel on. Put back all 5 lug nuts, bottom them out in a cross pattern and also in a cross pattern. Tighten them to 130 foot-pounds. Once again, 130 foot-pounds in a cross pattern. All right, repeat the procedure on the other side. Pump up your brake pedal, top off the master cylinder, and take it for a road test.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.